The gun was already on the table when Warren Ford walked through the door. Beatrice Yates had put it there herself, a single-action Colt revolver, her father's old piece, polished and loaded and pointing toward the empty chair across from her. She sat straight-backed at the kitchen table, her dark hair pinned but not carefully, her jaw set with the particular kind of hardness that comes not from cruelty, but from a woman who has been frightened too long, and decided this morning she was finished being frightened. The lamp above the table threw gold across the room. Outside, the New Mexico wind was picking up, rattling the shutters, carrying the smell of rain that never came. She heard the hoofbeats stop. She heard boots on the porch. She heard the knock, which surprised her because men who came to collect debts from dead men did not usually knock. "Miss Yates." The voice was low and dry like creek beds in August. "Name's Warren Ford. I'd like a word." Beatrice did not move. "Doors open," she said. He came in slowly, the way men who have been shot at learn to move through thresholds, and she got her first real look at him. Tall, lean in the way that suggested he had missed more meals than he'd eaten over the past year. Dark hat pushed back on his head, revealing a face that was not handsome in any soft sense, but carried something in it that was difficult to look away from. A scar along his jaw. Eyes that were gray-green and carried, she thought, an exhaustion so deep it had started to look like grief. He was maybe 28, maybe 30. He wore a canvas duster, trail-dusted and worn at the elbows, and his hand did not go near his holster when he saw the gun on the table. That was what made her breathe again. He looked at the Colt, looked at her, and something almost like the ghost of wry acknowledgement crossed his face. "I'm not here to threaten you," he said. "My father said those exact words to my mother twice a week," Beatrice said. "I have found that statement to be meaningless on its own." Warren Ford pulled out the chair across from her and sat down without being invited, which should have made her angrier than it did. He folded his hands on the table. He did not touch the gun. He looked at her with those gray-green eyes and said, very quietly, "Your father borrowed $400 from a man named Caleb Marsh 2 years ago, signed a promissory note. Marsh sold the note to me for 50 cents on the dollar when he left for California. The note came due in March. It's now June. I'm here for the money." Beatrice's hands stayed flat on the table. She had known this moment was coming for 3 months. She had rehearsed it 100 times in the dark hours before dawn, had practiced what she would say, had told herself she would not show fear. But now that it was here, now that it was sitting across from her in the form of a man with grief in his eyes and a legal claim to everything her father had left her, she felt something crack open in her chest that she had not expected. Not fear. Something older than fear. "My father died in January," she said. "Pneumonia. He died owing more than I can ever count to men I've never met, for reasons he never explained to me. I run this ranch alone. I have 11 head of cattle, a broken well pump, a horse that's 20 years old, and $47 in a tin beneath this floor." She paused. "You can have the $47. Warren Ford looked at her for a long time, and that was where everything changed. Because a man who was only here to collect a debt would have taken the $47 and left, or he would have laughed and threatened, or he would have pulled out the note and cited chapter and verse about what was legally his. He did none of those things. He sat across from her with his hands folded, and he looked at her like she was a problem he was trying to solve rather than an obstacle he intended to flatten, and after a very long silence he said, "Tell me about the well pump." Beatrice stared at him. "What?" "The broken well pump," Warren said. "Tell me what's wrong with it." She had arrived at this moment after 8 months of unrelenting disaster, and to understand how Warren Ford's question cracked something open in her that $400 of debt and a loaded gun could not, you had to understand what those 8 months had been. Hector Yates had not been a bad man. He had been a dreamer, which in the territory of New Mexico in 1882 was almost the same thing and sometimes worse. He had come out from Tennessee in 1865 after the war with $40 and a land patent, and the absolute conviction that cattle ranching in the Pecos River Basin was the future of the American West. He had not been entirely wrong about that. In the good years, the Yates spread had run 200 head, employed 4 hands, and provided a life for Hector and his wife Margaret and their daughter Beatrice that was not luxurious, but was solid and real and hers. Margaret Yates had died of fever when Beatrice was 12. After that, Hector had tried his best, which meant Beatrice had largely raised herself, educated herself from a shelf of books her mother had brought from Nashville, and run more and more of the actual operation of the ranch, while her father pursued increasingly ambitious and increasingly unsuccessful ventures. The loans had started small: $100 to expand the herd, $50 to repair the barn. The promissory notes had accumulated the way debt always does, slowly and then all at once, and by the time Hector Yates caught pneumonia on a January night and died before morning, the ranch that bore his name was mortgaged to 4 different creditors and held together by Beatrice's refusal to acknowledge that it was finished. She was 23 years old. She had been running this property almost alone since autumn. The 2 hands who had stayed on after her father got sick had left in February when it became clear the payroll was not coming. The horse, whose name was Absalom because her father had a sense of humor about difficult things, was too old to be sold for anything meaningful. The cattle were healthy, but not enough of them to drive to market with only 1 person and 1 ancient horse. The well pump had cracked in the February freeze, and she had been hauling water from the creek 300 yards away every single day since then. And into this had walked Warren Ford. She told him about the well pump. She told him in the clipped, factual way she had developed because it used less energy than bitterness, and he listened in that particular way he had of listening, completely still, his eyes on her face, not interrupting. When she finished, he nodded once. "I can fix that," he said. "You can fix a well pump." "I can fix most things," he said without pride, just as a statement of fact. "I grew up on a farm in Missouri. Before the trail, before all the rest of it, I knew how to fix things." He paused. "The seal's cracked most likely. Freeze will do that. You need a new leather piston seal. Hardware store in Cimarron would have it." Beatrice looked at him. She was not a woman who was easy to astonish, but she felt astonished. "Why would you tell me that?" Warren looked down at his folded hands. Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite name. "Because you put a loaded gun on a table and sat there alone waiting for me," he said, "and that tells me you haven't had anybody in your corner for a long time." The silence that followed that statement was the longest and strangest silence Beatrice Yates had experienced in 8 months of very long silences. "You still want your $400, she said finally. "I want to sleep in your barn tonight," he said, "and talk about the rest of it in the morning." She should have said no. Every practical instinct she had, every lesson her father's disasters had taught her about trusting strangers with hidden motives and promises that turned to smoke, said she should take the $47 out from under the floor and put it on the table and tell Warren Ford good evening. But something she could not name, some quieter instinct below the practical ones, said something else. "The barn has rats," she said. "I've slept with worse company," he said. She let him stay. She lay awake that night in her small room off the kitchen, listening to the wind and the distant sound of a horse settling, and she thought about gray-green eyes and the question about the well pump. She thought about dark pasts and hidden motives, and the way a man who meant harm did not usually ask about broken machinery. She thought about how alone she had been, specifically and concretely alone in the way that meant no one to tell when something went wrong, and no one to ask when she didn't know what to do. Alone in a way that had gotten into her bones and become so familiar she had almost stopped feeling it. She fell asleep before she finished thinking. In the morning, Warren Ford was already at the well. He had found the pump, assessed it with the quick efficiency of someone who had done this before, and was examining the mechanism with dirty hands and focused eyes when Beatrice came out at first light with 2 cups of coffee. She stood and watched him for a moment before he heard her, and in that unguarded moment she saw something in the set of his shoulders that she recognized from her own reflection. the posture of someone who was most comfortable when their hands had something useful to do, because useful hands meant they didn't have to think about everything else. He heard her and straightened, and she handed him the coffee, and they stood in the early light drinking it without speaking, which should have been awkward and wasn't. "I need to ask you something," Beatrice said. "All right. Who is Warren Ford?" She looked at him steadily over the rim of her cup. "Not the name. The man. Because men who come to collect debts from dead ranchers don't usually ask about well pumps and sleep in barns and fix things in the morning. So I want to know who you are and what you actually want, because I am not my father and I do not accept things at face value." Warren was quiet for a moment. He drank his coffee. He looked out across her land, which in the morning light was actually beautiful in its austere way, the mesa rising in the east, the scrub grass pale gold, the sky going from deep blue to something closer to hope. "I was a soldier," he said. "Union Army Missouri volunteers. Came back from the war and found my family's farm had been burned. Southern sympathizers, somebody said. Never found out for certain. My parents were dead. My younger brother had gone west with a cattle outfit." He paused. "I spent about 5 years after that doing things I am not proud of. Working for men whose methods I didn't examine closely enough because the pay was good, and I told myself I didn't care." Another pause. "Caleb Marsh was one of those men." Beatrice said nothing. She waited. "I left Marsh's employ 2 years ago," Warren said. "I bought your father's note off him not because I intended to collect it, but because I knew if I didn't buy it, Marsh would sell it to someone who would come here with a different approach than knocking." He turned to look at her. "I've been holding that note for 8 months. I only came now because I heard Hector Yates died, and I thought his family should know the debt existed." The morning light fell between them. "You bought my debt to protect us from Caleb Marsh," Beatrice said slowly. "I bought your debt because I was trying to do one thing that wasn't crooked," Warren said. "I'm not asking for a medal. I'm telling you who I am because you asked and you deserve an honest answer." Beatrice looked at him for a long time. She was cataloging things. She always cataloged things. It was the way she had survived. She cataloged the steadiness of his hands, the fact that he had made no move toward her in a situation where a different kind of man would have, the specificity of his confession, the absence of self-pity in the telling of it. "The seal for the pump will cost about 60 cents, she said finally. "There's a hardware merchant in Cimarron named Aldous Webb. I have an account there. If you ride in this morning, you can be back by afternoon." Warren looked at her. "You're sending me to get a pump seal." "I'm sending you to get a pump seal," she agreed. "And while you're gone, I'll figure out what the $400 is worth and what I have that might be worth something close to it." "Beatrice," he said, and the sound of her name in his voice, direct and undecorated, stopped her. "I told you, I'm not here to take your ranch." "I know," she said. "But I don't accept charity either. We'll find a fair arrangement." He looked at her with something that might have been respect and went to saddle his horse. The week that followed was the strangest and most disorienting of Beatrice's life, which was saying something considering the previous 8 months. Warren Ford was not what she had expected in any single particular. He was quiet in the way that was not emptiness but restraint, the kind of man who spoke when he had something worth saying and was comfortable in silence otherwise. He fixed the well pump on the afternoon of his return, working with the focused efficiency that was becoming familiar to her, and the sound of water flowing normally up through the pipe was so unexpectedly significant after months of hauling that she had to turn away so he wouldn't see her eyes fill. He was careful about that, she noticed. He seemed to understand instinctively which things mattered to her and which revelations of feeling she would want privacy for, and he gave her that privacy without making a performance of giving it. It was a quality she had encountered almost nowhere before. He repaired a section of fence on the east pasture that had been sagging since autumn. He looked at the cattle with an eye that told her he knew what he was looking at, identified which 2 animals were showing early signs of foot rot, told her what to do about it. He made himself useful in ways she had not asked for and did not comment on, And each evening when the work was done, he sat on the porch and she brought out 2 cups of whatever she had, coffee mostly, sometimes just water, and they talked. The talking was the unexpected part. Beatrice had been largely without genuine conversation for 8 months. She had talked to merchants, and to the doctor when her father was sick, and to the 2 hands before they left, but none of that had been conversation in the real sense. Warren Ford talked to her like she was someone whose thoughts were worth hearing, which was more radical than it sounded in 1882 New Mexico territory. And she discovered in those evening hours on the porch that she had more thoughts than she had realized, accumulated in the silence, waiting. She told him about her mother's books. She had read everything on that shelf 3 times, including 2 volumes of natural philosophy that she suspected most women in the territory had never opened. She told him about the mechanics of cattle management that she had taught herself from a veterinary manual, about the creek that ran through the property's northeast corner and the way it was slowly changing course, about the Apache encampment she could see from the high ground to the east, a settlement of Jicarilla people who had been reduced by treaty and hardship to a small community on land that nobody else wanted, and how she had traded with them occasionally. Beeswax and grain for dried meat and knowledge about the land, and how that trade had been the most mutually honest commerce she had conducted since her father died. Warren listened to all of it. He asked questions that told her he was actually listening, not waiting for his turn to speak. He asked about the creek's change of course, about the specifics of the cattle management problem, about the Jicarilla trade. He did not tell her she was remarkable for knowing these things, which would have been condescending, but she could see that he was genuinely interested, and that interest, plain and unperformative, was more affecting than any compliment. On the 5th evening she asked him directly what he intended to do next. He was quiet for a while, looking out at the darkening sky. Somewhere distant a coyote called and was answered. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I've been moving for 5 years. I know how to ride towards something, but I'm not sure I remember how to stop somewhere and mean it." He paused. "I've been thinking about it more since I came here." "Because of the ranch?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral. He looked at her sideways, and there was something in that look that was both careful and unguarded at the same time. "Because of the company," he said. The air between them shifted. Beatrice was not a woman who flushed easily or got flustered, but she felt something move through her chest at those words, something warm and somewhat dangerous, the kind of feeling that her mother's novels had described in language she had always thought overwrought but which now seemed, unexpectedly, accurate. She looked back out at the darkening mesa and said, "You're still sleeping in a barn." "I'm aware," Warren said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite a smile but was close enough to one that she felt it. She lay awake that night again, but this time the wakefulness was different. Less dread, more something else. Something she examined carefully and honestly because she was a careful and honest person. She was not a woman who mistook kindness for love or attention for devotion, and she was acutely aware of the particular vulnerability of her situation, alone and financially desperate and grateful, all 3 of which could conspire to make a woman see things in a man that were more her own need than his reality. She examined Warren Ford in her mind with the same methodical rigor she brought to the veterinary manual and the cattle accounts. What she found, after careful examination, was not wishful thinking. He was genuine. She could not yet know all of him, but what she had seen was genuine, and that, she decided, was enough to continue. The question of the debt was resolved in the 2nd week in a manner neither of them had anticipated. Beatrice had been cataloging the ranch's assets with her usual thoroughness when she found, in the bottom of her father's roll-top desk, beneath a layer of outdated newspapers and dried-out inkwells, a deed. Not to the Yates ranch, which she held, but to a separate parcel of 40 acres 3 miles north, a piece of land her father had apparently acquired in a card game and subsequently forgotten about, or possibly been too embarrassed to mention. The deed was legitimate. Beatrice rode out to see the parcel and found it was good grassland with reliable water access from a spring-fed creek, the kind of land that was worth significantly more than $400 to a man who knew cattle. She came back and laid the deed on the kitchen table in front of Warren Ford. "That land is worth $600 at current prices," she said. "Possibly more. There's a lawyer in Cimarron who can confirm the deed is valid. You take that parcel, the debt is cleared, and there's $200 in my favor that I'll consider repayment for the pump and the fence work." Warren looked at the deed. He looked at her. "You want to sell me 40 acres 3 miles north," he said. "I want to settle an honest debt with an honest exchange," she said. "Take it or don't." He picked up the deed and read it carefully. She watched him read it, watched the way his eyes moved across the document with the steadiness of someone who was not easily surprised by legal language. He set it back down. "I'll take it," he said, "on one condition." "I don't do conditions," she said. "You'll do this one," he said, not unkindly. "The condition is that I work that parcel properly, and when I'm established on it, you and I talk about a formal partnership arrangement for the combined operations. Your cattle experience my labor. Shared revenue on sales. Written contract, fair terms witnessed in Cimarron." Beatrice stared at him. "You want to go into business with me?" "I want to stay," he said simply. "And I want it to be on terms that are fair to both of us and not me doing you a favor because I can see you wouldn't accept that." "You're right that I wouldn't," she said. She sat down across from him because this required sitting down. "You've been moving for 5 years and you want to stop here." "I want to stop here," he said. "Why?" The word came out quieter than she intended, more exposed. Warren Ford looked at her across the kitchen table, the same table where she had put a loaded gun 2 weeks ago, and his gray-green eyes were direct and honest in a way that was almost uncomfortable. "Because you make me want to be the kind of man who deserves to stop somewhere," he said. Beatrice was 30 seconds from saying something she would not be able to take back, so she stood up and said, "I'll write to the lawyer in Cimarron tomorrow," and went into the kitchen and stood very still for a long moment with her hands on the counter, listening to her own heartbeat. The lawyer, a meticulous man named Silas Crane who had been practicing in Colfax County for 15 years, confirmed the deed was valid and drew up both the transfer of the North Parcel and a business partnership agreement between Beatrice Yates and Warren Ford, equal shares, witnessed, and notarized on a Tuesday afternoon in early July. Beatrice signed her name in her clear, strong handwriting. Warren signed his beside it. Crane stamped the documents with bureaucratic satisfaction, and the thing was done. They rode back from Cimarron in the late afternoon, side by side on the road that wound through scrub juniper and red clay, and for a long stretch neither of them spoke because there was nothing that needed saying and they were both comfortable with that now. Then Warren said, "Tell me something you've never told anyone." Beatrice looked at him. "That's a significant request." "I know." She thought about it for a while, the horses walking steady under a sky that was going amber and rose in the west. She thought about what was true and unspoken, what was hidden behind the practicality and the competence and the refusal to show fear. "I used to pretend," she said finally, "when my father was still alive and things were still going badly, that someone would come. Not to rescue me, I never wanted rescuing, but to see the whole situation clearly and say, this is what's wrong and here is what we do about it. Like a partner. Not a knight from one of my mother's novels, just a practical person who could see what I could see and work alongside me." She paused. "I stopped letting myself pretend that about 6 months before my father died. I decided it was a luxury I couldn't afford." Warren was quiet for a moment. "And now?" "And now I have a business partner," she said carefully, "and I am trying to determine whether that's the same thing." He looked at her, and the look was long and steady and full of something that had been building for 2 weeks and that she had been cataloging carefully and that she knew now was not her imagination or her need or her vulnerability speaking. It was real and it was mutual and it was, in its current state, still beautifully tentative. "It could be," he said, "if you wanted it to be." "I want things to be honest between us," she said. "So I'm telling you clearly, I am interested in you, Warren Ford, and I am also cautious. I've watched my father trust the wrong things his whole life, and I intend not to repeat that. So if this becomes something more than a business arrangement, I need it to be real and I need it to be earned. Those are the most reasonable terms I've ever been offered, Warren said. Good, she said. Then we understand each other. We do, he said, and he was smiling now just slightly, and it changed his face in a way she found she had to look away from because it was too much, the reality of it. The summer of 1882 in Colfax County, New Mexico Territory was hot and complicated, and full of the kind of violence that the territory had been trying to outrun since the Lincoln County War had burned through it 4 years earlier. The cattle trade was booming, but so was the conflict over land, water rights, and the railroad expansion that was reshaping the entire region. Warren's north parcel sat near a route that two competing interests were both claiming as a right-of-way, and within a month of the deed transfer, a man named Rupert Hollies, who represented a land syndicate out of Denver, arrived at the gate of the Yates property with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and a briefcase full of papers. Beatrice met him at the gate. She had a gift for reading people that had developed out of years of managing a father, who hid his debts and hands, who hid their laziness, and merchants who hid their margins. She read Rupert Hollies in about 45 seconds and found behind the smooth manner and the expensive coat a particular kind of danger, the danger of the man who operates entirely within the letter of the law and entirely against its spirit, who traps people with documents and pressure, and the implied threat of things he never quite says out loud. He wanted Warren's parcel. He was willing to pay for it, he said, but the number he offered was barely above what Warren had effectively paid for it, and he delivered the offer with the particular tone that implied there were consequences to refusal he preferred not to enumerate. Mr. Ford is not on the property right now, Beatrice said pleasantly. I'll relay your interest to him. You do that, Holly said, and he let his eyes move across the property in a way that was meant to communicate appraisal and found it lacking. Tell him the offer has a time limit. Most things do, Beatrice agreed, and waited until he had ridden back down the road before she allowed herself to feel afraid. She told Warren that evening on the porch. She told him all of it, including the exact tone Hollies had used and what she had read into it. Warren listened without interruption. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and she saw something move through him that was not quite anger but was adjacent to it, that controlled, directed version of anger that is more dangerous than the uncontrolled kind because it knows where it's going. Caleb Marsh used to work with Denver syndicates, he said carefully. Beatrice felt the hair on her arms rise. You think Hollies is connected to Marsh? I think it's possible, he said. And I think if he is, then this isn't just about the right-of-way. It's about finding me and seeing how much I still know. He paused. Marsh wasn't legal in his operations. I was in a position to know certain things about how he operated. I told you I left his employ 2 years ago. I left because I found out something I couldn't unknow and I made a choice about what to do with it. What did you find out? Beatrice asked. The evening light was deep orange and red behind him. His hands were still on his knees, but his jaw was tight. Marsh was moving cattle he didn't own, Warren said, not rustling in the ordinary sense. He was using his debt instruments, the notes, the mortgages, to seize property when people defaulted, and then selling the seized livestock before the legal process was complete. Twice I know of, the families that lost those cattle were families who had reason to be suspect in his eyes, Mexican families in the lower territory. He knew the courts wouldn't move fast for them. He paused. I found the documentation. I kept copies. I sent them to a federal land office when I left. Beatrice looked at him. You have evidence against Caleb Marsh. I have evidence against Caleb Marsh, he confirmed. And if Marsh sent Hollies to find me, then what's happening here isn't about a right-of-way. It's about those documents. Where are the copies? Beatrice asked. He looked at her steadily. In my saddlebag. I've been carrying them for 2 years. The weight of that fell between them. 2 years of carrying the evidence of another man's crimes, moving constantly, sleeping in barns and trail camps, staying ahead of the possibility that Marsh would track him down. Not quite a fugitive and not quite free. The dark past that had been sitting in his saddlebag all along, following him from Missouri to New Mexico, finally arriving at a kitchen table with a loaded gun on it. "All right," Beatrice said. She was already thinking, already assembling the pieces. "The federal land office you sent the documents to, who was the contact?" "A deputy marshal named Everett Cross out of Santa Fe." "Then we need to write to Everett Cross," Beatrice said, "and we need to do it before Hollis comes back." She stood up. "Come inside. I'm going to write the letter and you're going to tell me everything that's in those documents so I can describe them accurately. We'll have it posted tomorrow morning." Warren stood up too and looked at her with that expression she was becoming familiar with, the one that mixed surprise with something deeper, the look of a man who had been alone with a problem for so long that being met in the middle of it by another person was almost physically disorienting. "You're not frightened," he said. "I'm extremely frightened," she said. "I write better when I'm frightened. Come inside." They spent 3 hours at the kitchen table that night, the lamp burning, Beatrice writing in her clear, careful hand while Warren told her everything he knew about Caleb Marsh's operations, the names, dates, property descriptions, and the nature of the documents he carried. She wrote 2 letters, one to Deputy Marshal Everett Cross in Santa Fe, and one to a newspaper editor in Albuquerque, whose publication had been running pieces on land fraud in the territory. She addressed them and sealed them and set them by the door. Then she made coffee because it was 10 o'clock and neither of them was sleeping, and they sat at the table in the lamplight and Beatrice said, "Tell me the rest of it." "What rest?" "Whatever's still in you," she said simply. "Whatever you've been carrying besides the documents." He looked at her for a long time. The lamp moved between them, sending the light shifting. "I did things for Marsh that I can defend on legal grounds but not on moral ones," he said. "I collected debts from people who were already suffering. I was the man who knocked on the door, the same way I knocked on yours. I told myself the notes were legal and the debts were real and I was just an instrument of a legitimate transaction." He paused. "I knew that was not the whole truth even when I was telling myself it was." "And your father's farm," Beatrice said quietly. "You never found out who burned it." His hands tightened on the coffee cup. "No. So you came west looking for your brother and instead found Marsh." "Found his outfit first," Warren said. "My brother had gone farther on. By the time I found work with Marsh, I'd been on the trail 6 months, and I was not in a state to be particular about who employed me." He looked at the table. "My brother's in Colorado now, working a mine near Leadville. I got a letter from him last year." "Do you write to him?" "Occasionally." "You should write to him more," Beatrice said. Something shifted in Warren's face. It was not quite a smile and not quite pain, somewhere between them the expression of a man who has been told something true and unexpectedly simple. "You're probably right," he said. "I'm usually right," she said. "I'll tell you when I'm uncertain." He looked at her across the table in the lamplight and said, "Beatrice," in that direct way he had of saying her name, like it was a whole sentence in itself. "Don't," she said, not unkindly. "Not tonight. Tonight we have letters to post in the morning and a problem to manage. The rest of it will wait." "Will it?" he said, and there was something in his voice that made it a genuine question. "It has been waiting for 2 weeks," she said. "It can wait a little longer. Good night, Warren." He went back to the barn. She sat at the kitchen table for a while longer, the 2 letters in front of her, listening to the wind and thinking about gray-green eyes and dark pasts, and the way certain problems, when you looked at them honestly, revealed themselves to be not problems at all but something you had been moving toward without knowing it. The letters went out in the morning. Rupert Hollis came back on Thursday. He did not come alone this time. He brought 2 men who stayed on their horses near the gate while he walked up to the porch, and their purpose was to be seen, which was exactly the kind of implied threat that Beatrice had expected. She came out onto the porch before he reached the steps and stood there with her arms folded, calm in a way she had constructed deliberately, and said, "Mr. Hollies, Mr. Ford is on the north parcel this morning. You can speak with me, or you can ride out there and speak with him directly." "I prefer to speak with Ford," Hollies said. "Then ride north," she said pleasantly. "Follow the dry stream bed, about 1.5 miles." Hollies looked at her with the particular contempt that certain men reserve for women who don't give them the reaction they want. "You understand that your own situation here is not without complications," he said carefully. "Most situations are complicated," Beatrice agreed. "Good morning, Mr. Hollies." He rode north. She went inside and spent 20 minutes cursing under her breath while she washed the breakfast dishes, then saddled Absalom and rode north herself, because she was not going to let Warren face this without her. She arrived at the north parcel to find Warren and Hollies in conversation, and to find the conversation already past threatening, both men standing about 10 feet apart in the open grassland, Warren's horse ground-tied nearby, Hollies still mounted along with his 2 accompanying men. Warren's posture was controlled and neutral, hands at his sides, his face giving nothing away. Beatrice pulled Absalom up at the edge of the parcel and listened. "The note you hold on the Jimenez property is not legitimate," Warren was saying, and his voice was steady and very quiet, the quiet that was more frightening than volume. "I know how it was obtained because I was present when it was drawn. Marsh used a forged signature. I have testimony to that effect." Hollies' face had gone tight. "You have no idea what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying," Warren said. "And so does the deputy marshal in Santa Fe, because I corresponded with him 18 months ago and I corresponded with him again this week." He paused. "Marsh sent you to find me, Hollies. I understand that. You can go back and tell him that what he's looking for is already in federal hands, and the smartest thing he can do at this point is leave me and this property alone, because the moment anything comes at me or the people on this property, everything I know goes to the Albuquerque paper and the territorial governor's office and anywhere else it needs to go." Hollies stared at him. The 2 men on horses behind him exchanged a glance. "You're bluffing," Hollies said. "I'm not a man who bluffs," Warren said. "I'm a man who carried documentation of federal crimes for 2 years and waited for the right moment to use it properly. I've found the right moment. Go back to Marsh." Hollies held the stare for a long moment. Beatrice, watching from the edge of the parcel, did not breathe. Then Hollies turned his horse without another word and rode south, his 2 men falling in behind him. Warren stood watching them go until they were out of sight. Then his shoulders dropped about an inch and he turned and saw Beatrice on Absalom at the edge of his land. She rode up to him. "You told me you sent the documents 18 months ago," she said. "I did." "You said you wrote Cross again this week." She looked at him. "You didn't say that in the letter." "No," he agreed. "I hadn't written it yet when I was talking to Hollies." The ghost of something crossed his face. "I may have been slightly ahead of the truth on that particular point." Beatrice looked at him. "You bluffed." "I said I'm not a man who bluffs." "You lied to him." "I was planning to write the letter this afternoon," Warren said with perfect composure, and then she laughed. It came out of her unexpectedly, real and unguarded, the kind of laugh she hadn't produced in 8 months, and Warren Ford looked at her as though she had done something extraordinary, as though the specific sound of Beatrice Yates laughing was something he intended to remember for a very long time. "Write the letter," she said, still laughing. "Today. This afternoon," he promised. "As soon as I finish staking the east boundary." They rode back to the main house together, and somewhere on that 1.5 miles of red clay road Beatrice Yates made her decision, not about the ranch or the business or the debt. Those were already decided, but about the other thing, the thing she had been cataloging for 3 weeks and had now accumulated enough evidence to act on. She made the decision quietly, in the way she made most decisions, without announcement. She would tell him tonight on the porch. She did not get to tell him on the porch that night, because at dusk a rider came from the Jicarilla settlement to the east, a young man named Yusef who had traded with Beatrice twice before, and who spoke adequate English. arriving at speed with news that one of Holly's men had been seen in the morning riding into the settlement and speaking to people there, asking questions about the Yates property and about a man named Ford. This was a different kind of threat than the confrontation at the North Parcel. This was Holly's looking for allies or leverage or information, and it mattered because the Hikaria people were already in a precarious enough situation without being pulled into the affairs of a Denver land syndicate. Beatrice invited Yusef in, gave him water and bread, and listened to everything he had to say. Then she thanked him carefully and sent him back with a message for the settlement's elder, a man named Takoda, that she would come in the morning if he was willing to receive her. Yusef left. Beatrice turned to Warren, who had listened to all of this from the kitchen doorway. "I need to visit the settlement tomorrow," she said. "And I need to write to Takoda's people in a way that makes clear what's happening and why, because they deserve to understand the situation they're being drawn into." "I'll come with you," Warren said. "Takoda doesn't know you." "He will after tomorrow," Warren said simply. She thought about it for 2 seconds. "All right," she said. "Now will you write the letter to Cross?" He wrote the letter. She wrote a separate message for Takoda's settlement. They were both at the table, both writing, in a domestic shared industry that felt so right and so natural, and so unlike anything Beatrice had experienced before that she almost said what she intended to say right then, at the kitchen table, over correspondence. She stopped herself with some effort and kept writing. The visit to the Hikaria settlement the next morning was the most significant thing that happened in the 3rd week of Warren Ford's presence on the Yates property. And it was significant not only for practical reasons, but because of what it showed Beatrice about who Warren was when he was not already on familiar ground. Takoda was 60 years old, weathered and measured and possessed of the particular dignity of a man who has survived things that would have broken anyone with less integrity. He received them in front of the main dwelling of the settlement, which was modest but maintained with evident care, and his expression when they arrived was neither welcoming nor hostile but watchful, the expression of a man who had been given many reasons not to trust the people who rode in from the surrounding ranches. Beatrice spoke first, in the careful way she always spoke with Takoda, directly and without condescension. She explained what she knew about Holly's and the land syndicate and why the man had ridden into the settlement, and she was honest about the fact that the trouble had arrived in her life partly through Warren's presence and his history. Takoda listened. He asked 3 questions, all of them sharp and perceptive. Then he looked at Warren. Warren met his gaze without looking away or performing any particular kind of friendliness. He sat very still on his horse and he said, "I came into this territory with a debt I was owed, and I have been given more than I came looking for. I intend to stay if I can do it honestly. Whatever the syndicate was trying to find out from your people, I would like to know it, and I would like to offer what I can in exchange for your telling me." Takoda was quiet for a long time. Then he said something in his own language that Beatrice did not understand, and Yusef translated. "He says the syndicate's man was asking about water rights along the North Creek. He says the syndicate believes there is a stronger claim to that water than the one in your deed." Warren and Beatrice looked at each other. "The spring-fed creek on the North Parcel," Beatrice said quietly. "Is there a prior claim?" Warren asked Takoda directly. After another pause and another exchange that Yusef translated, Takoda said that there was documentation of a water use agreement between the settlement and the previous owner of the North Parcel, a man named Garrett who had sold the land to Hector Yates 12 years ago, predating Hector Yates' ownership entirely. This was, on its face, a complication. A prior water use agreement predating the current deed meant that Warren's claim to exclusive use of the creek on his parcel was not as clean as the deed itself suggested. But Beatrice was already thinking. "If Holly's and Marsh know about this prior agreement," she said to Warren quietly, "they may be planning to use it to challenge your deed. Claim that the title is clouded, force a legal dispute, use that dispute to gain access to the property through the courts." "Which is exactly the kind of move Marsh would make," Warren agreed. Beatrice turned to Takoda. She thought for a moment. Then she said, "The water use agreement between your people and the man Garrett. Is it documented? Do you have the document?" Yusef translated. Takoda considered. Then he nodded slowly. "Would you be willing," Beatrice said carefully, "to formalize that agreement in a new document, one that we all sign, that acknowledges your settlement's water rights along the North Creek, in exchange for a written acknowledgement from us of those rights going forward? Not a subordination of your claim, but a mutual recognition that the creek is shared, equally, and that neither party can sell or transfer those rights without the other's agreement." This was a more significant offer than it might have seemed on the surface. It meant Warren's North Parcel had a shared water right rather than an exclusive one, which reduced its commercial value somewhat. But it also meant that Marsh and Hollies could not use the prior agreement to cloud the title, because the prior agreement would be formally acknowledged and absorbed into a new mutual document, leaving nothing in dispute. Takoda listened to Yusef's translation. He looked at Beatrice, then at Warren, then at Beatrice again. He said something that Yusef translated as, "She has been honest in trade before. Is the man also honest?" Beatrice looked at Warren. Warren said, "I'm trying to be." Yusef translated. Something in Takoda's face changed very slightly. He agreed to the document. They rode back in the late morning with Takoda's commitment, and the knowledge that they would need to return with Sela's crane from Cimarron to draw up the formal agreement. It was 2 more days' work and another trip to town, but it was clean and it was right, and it removed one of the weapons from Marsh's arsenal. On the road back, with the settlement behind them and the North Parcel ahead and the main house in the distance catching the noon sun, Warren said, "You didn't have to offer the shared rights arrangement." "I know," Beatrice said. "Most people wouldn't have. Most people haven't been trading honestly with that settlement for 2 years," she said. "Takoda trusted us today partly on the basis of past dealings. That trust is worth protecting." She paused. "Also, the arrangement is genuinely fair. His people have used that creek for longer than my father owned that land. The prior agreement should have been in the deed to begin with." Warren was quiet for a moment. "You're a remarkable woman, Beatrice Yates. You're not the first person to say that in lieu of saying something more direct," she said. He looked at her sharply. Something passed across his face. "All right," he said. "Then I'll be direct." He pulled his horse to a stop. She stopped Absalom beside him. The noon sun was on both of them, the mesa behind, the red clay road stretching ahead, everything very still and very bright. "I know what I want. I've known it for most of the 3 weeks I've been here. I've been waiting because I wanted to be sure it was real and not just gratitude or proximity. And I've had enough experience with my own worst impulses to know the difference, so I waited until I was sure." He looked at her directly. "I want to court you properly, Beatrice. Formally, if you'll have it, I want to do it right." She held his gaze. 3 weeks of cataloging, of careful and honest examination, and here was the moment the catalog had been building toward. "Formally," she said. "Formally," he confirmed. "In 1882, she said, with just a trace of something that might have been the leading edge of a smile, "formally means you would speak to my father. My father is dead." "Then I'll speak to you," he said, "directly, which is what I'm doing." Beatrice Yates looked at Warren Ford in the noon sun on the Colfax County Road, and thought about her mother's novels and about practicality, and about the difference between the life you thought you were getting and the one that actually arrived, and she said, "Yes, court me properly, Warren, and don't make me wait too long." The smile that crossed his face then was full and real, and transformed him so completely that she felt it in her chest like the first water from a repaired well. They rode the rest of the way home in a silence that was the happiest silence Beatrice could remember. The legal matters took another 3 weeks to resolve entirely. Sela's crane came out and drew up the water-sharing document with Takoda's settlement. All parties signed. It was filed in Cimarron. The letter to Deputy Marshal Everett Cross in Santa Fe produced results faster than Beatrice had expected. Cross had been building a case against Caleb Marsh for over a year, and Warren's documentation, combined with his willingness to appear as a witness, was the piece he had needed. Cross sent a deputy to collect Warren's original documents in mid-August. Holly's disappeared from the county around the same time, which Cross's deputy confirmed was not a coincidence. Marsh himself was indicted by federal authority in September on charges that included fraud, forgery, and theft. Warren was notified by letter. He read the letter on the porch with Beatrice beside him, and when he finished he folded it carefully and held it in both hands for a moment, and she saw something happen in his face that was not relief exactly, but was the absence of something that had been there for 2 years, like a weight he had been carrying so long he had forgotten the exact shape of it until it was gone. She put her hand over his. He looked at her. "Done," she said. "Done," he agreed. The courtship was the best thing Beatrice Yates had ever been part of. Warren Ford courted her with the same focused attention he brought to everything he did, which meant she was never in doubt of his intentions, but also never felt crowded, because he understood the particular way she needed to be known, gradually and honestly, without performance. He brought her a book he'd found in Cimarron's general store, A Natural History of the American Southwest, because he'd remembered what she said about the veterinary manual and the natural philosophy texts. She read it in 3 days and left it on the table with a dozen penciled notes in the margins, and he read those notes and they talked about them, and the conversation ran for 2 evenings, and she understood somewhere in the middle of it that this was what she had been looking for without knowing the exact name of it. Companionship. Genuine intellectual partnership in someone she was also falling in love with, the specific double fortune of being known and also desired. He kissed her for the first time on an evening in late August on the porch, unhurried and intentional, after a conversation that had wandered from the cattle accounts to the history of the territory, to what she would do if she could do anything. And when she said she would go to Santa Fe and see the university library because she had read about it and could not imagine the number of books, he said without hesitation that they should go, that he would take her. And then the momentum of that generosity carried her toward him, and the kiss was just the next true thing after all the other true things. She had been kissed before, twice, by men whose names she remembered but whose faces had become general. This was not like that. This was specific and certain and unhurried in a way that said he had been waiting to do this right and intended to continue doing it right. And when they separated, she sat for a moment with her eyes closed and thought, very clearly and with complete conviction, there you are. By September, they had settled into something that was both more and less than formal courtship, more because the understanding between them was already complete, and less because the formal structures of courtship assumed an audience and intermediaries, and a social scaffolding that neither of them had in Colfax County in 1882. So it was simply 2 people choosing each other every day, clearly and without hesitation. In October, Warren wrote to his brother Daniel in Leadville. He showed Beatrice the letter before he sent it. It was honest and careful and revealed more of himself than he'd probably intended, and she said, "This is a good letter," and he said, "I've been working up to it for a year," and she said, "Send it today," and he did. Daniel wrote back in November, a letter that was warmer than Warren had expected, full of his brother's characteristic humor and a complete lack of reproach for the years of infrequent contact. And Warren read it at the kitchen table, and Beatrice watched him read it and saw the same process she'd seen with the Marsh indictment letter, the leaving down of something heavy that had been carried too long. "He wants to come for Christmas," Warren said. "He should come for Christmas," Beatrice said. "I'll put him in the barn." "You put me in the barn." "And look how that turned out," she said. He laughed, and it was the same thing. The laugh had been the first time she'd heard it, full and real, a sound that seemed to surprise him slightly every time it emerged, as though he had not expected himself to be capable of this much uncomplicated joy. The proposal happened in November, on the north parcel, which by then had Warren's work visible in it, the staked boundaries, the section of fence he'd built, the small timber-framed shelter he'd constructed against the southern tree line for working the cattle in bad weather. He had spent 2 months making the parcel visibly, concretely his, and Beatrice had watched the progress from the main house and on her visits and had understood it as the act it was, a man rooting himself in a place, choosing to be somewhere, making it real. She was walking the east fence line with him when he stopped and said her name. She turned. He was standing in the afternoon light with the mesa behind him and the fall sky going deep blue overhead, and he looked more settled and more himself than she had ever seen him. The exhaustion and grief she had read in his face that first night in the kitchen mostly gone, replaced by something that was, she realized, simply what Warren Ford looked like when he was not afraid. "Marry me," he said. "Not because of the property or the partnership or the practical arrangement. Because I want to spend every day of my life talking to you and working alongside you, and because I love you, Beatrice, and I have been sure of that for longer than I've said it, and I want to stop not saying it." She stood in the afternoon light in November in New Mexico territory and felt the truth of it land in her exactly where it was aimed. No deflection, no catalog necessary, just the clean arrival of something she had been moving toward since the day she put a gun on the table and an unexpected man asked her about a well pump. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes. I love you too, Warren Ford, and I have been waiting for you to say that out loud for 2 months." He crossed the distance between them and she went to meet him halfway, and the embrace that followed was the kind that settled things, that closed doors on the past and opened windows onto the future, warm and certain and real. "Obviously, yes," he said with his face in her hair. "Obviously," she confirmed. They were married in Cimarron on a Saturday in December of 1882, in the office of the Justice of the Peace, a small ceremony with Silas Crane as witness and Daniel Ford, who had arrived from Leadville 3 days before, and who turned out to be a broadly built, red-haired man of 26 with his brother's eyes and a markedly more demonstrative manner, standing beside Warren with an expression of such unguarded happiness that Beatrice, who was not a crier, felt her eyes fill for a moment. Daniel had taken to Beatrice immediately and without apparent reservation. He had arrived with a trunk full of winter clothes and a determination to make up for 5 years of distance from his brother that was touching in its directness. He and Beatrice had spent the first day of his visit in the kitchen while Warren was on the north parcel, and Daniel had said frankly, "I was worried about my brother for a long time. He went somewhere very dark after the farm burned, and he didn't come back all the way for years. But looking at him now, looking at this place, I think he's come back." "He's been working at it," Beatrice said. "No," Daniel said. "He's been here 6 weeks and he's different, that's you." "That's both of us," Beatrice said firmly, and Daniel had nodded like she'd passed a test. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was cold and clear, and the work was hard in the way that work on a cattle operation in winter is always hard, but it was shared work now, which made every element of it different. Warren's practical knowledge filled in the specific gaps that Beatrice's self-education had left. Her thorough, systematic approach to the ranch's finances and planning brought structure to Warren's preference for direct action. They argued twice, genuine arguments about method and priority, both of which ended with the slower process of talking through it and arriving at a genuine synthesis rather than capitulation, which was how they had both always hoped arguments could work and had almost never experienced. Daniel stayed through January, working the north parcel with Warren during the day, and in the evenings sitting at the kitchen table with both of them in a warmth that was the first real family Beatrice had experienced since she was 12 years old. When he left for Leadville in February, he embraced his brother for a long time and then turned to Beatrice and said, "You have a standing invitation to Leadville, Mrs. Ford. Both of you, Mrs. Ford." Beatrice let herself feel that. It was not a diminishment, not the subsuming of Beatrice Yates into someone else's name, because they had talked about this too and Warren had said plainly that Yates was the name on the deed and the partnership and the history of this land, and if she wanted to keep it or combine it he would support either, and she had decided on combination: Beatrice Yates Ford on the legal documents, Beatrice Ford in daily life. Beatrice Yates for the parts of her that were specifically and stubbornly her mother's daughter and her own. In the spring of 1883, the Yates Ford operation, as it was beginning to be known in the county, made its first significant cattle drive to market. Warren hired two hands, a young man named Tobias Reyes who had grown up in the territory and knew it better than anyone, and an older man named Clarence Webb who was no relation to the hardware merchant but had his same meticulous approach to everything. Beatrice managed the logistics and the accounts. Warren and Tobias ran the actual drive, 23 head to Las Vegas, New Mexico, where the railroad had arrived and cattle prices were better than they'd been in years. The drive returned with more money than the Yates Ranch had seen in 4 years. Beatrice sat with the ledger that evening and ran the numbers 3 times to be sure, and then she said, "We're solvent." Warren was cleaning up at the washstand. He turned around. "Genuinely solvent," he said. "We have operating capital, a small surplus, and enough livestock to make next year's drive viable without any additional borrowing," she said. "We're solvent." He crossed the room and picked her up, which startled her into a sound she didn't normally make, and turned her in a circle in the kitchen while she held the ledger at arm's length to avoid wrinkling it, and then set her back on her feet and kissed her in a way that made her put the ledger down. "I need to post that to the accounts," she said when they separated. "It will keep," he said. It kept. In June of 1883, Beatrice told Warren she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning before either of them had fully woken, lying in the pale light with the window open and the sound of the birds coming in from the east, and she said it simply and directly, the way she said everything. He was very still for a moment. Then he put his hand very gently over hers. "Are you well?" He asked, and it was the right question, the first question, the question that told her everything she needed to know about who Warren Ford was and who he would continue to be. "I'm well," she said. "I feel strange in the mornings, but it passes. I've been reading the medical manual." She paused. "I'm glad." "I'm glad," he said, and his voice had something in it that she had learned to recognize as the particular note he carried when he was feeling something too large for ordinary expression. She turned to look at him and found his face open in a way that was still, after 8 months of marriage, slightly startling, because Warren Ford was not a man who wore his feelings prominently except with her, and the things she saw in him when he looked at her were still sometimes more than she'd expected. "A family," he said quietly. "The beginning of one," she agreed. The pregnancy was not easy in every moment. The territory of New Mexico in 1883 did not offer ideal conditions for the project, but Beatrice approached it with her characteristic practicality. The midwife in Cimarron was a woman of considerable experience named Mrs. Dolores Aldama, who had delivered more children in Colfax County than anyone alive, and who approved of Beatrice's methodical approach and her capacity not to panic over ordinary difficulties. Warren drove her to Cimarron for each visit with Mrs. Aldama, and sat in the street outside on the wagon, and did not pretend that the waiting was not difficult. Tobias Reyes, who had become something approaching a permanent fixture of the operation by this point, took on additional work during the later months without being asked. Clarence Webb fixed the barn roof in anticipation of a winter birth. Even the Jicarea settlement sent, through Yusef, a small package of dried herbs that Mrs. Aldama examined and confirmed were traditional preparations for safe delivery, and Beatrice received them with the solemnity they deserved. The baby arrived in February of 1884, a boy, 8 pounds and loudly vocal from the first moment, delivered by Mrs. Aldama in the bedroom off the kitchen with Warren in the next room, enduring the several hours of waiting with a visible patience that cost him considerably. When Mrs. Aldama came out and said, "You have a son, Mr. Ford," Warren was through the door before she finished the sentence. He stood in the room with the lamp low, and the winter night outside and Beatrice propped against the pillows looking exhausted and luminous and deeply satisfied. And she held up the bundle in her arms and said, "Come and meet your son." Warren sat on the edge of the bed and held the baby for the first time with the focused care of a man who had fixed 100 mechanical things and understood that some things required more gentleness than force. The baby had dark hair and the squinting, outraged expression of the newborn in hands that were impossibly small. "What shall we call him?" Warren asked, not looking up from the baby's face. "I've been thinking about James," Beatrice said. "James Henry Ford. Henry was my mother's father's name." "James Henry Ford," Warren said. "That's a good solid name for a person." "He'll need a solid name," Beatrice said. "He's going to grow up on this land, and he'll need to know exactly who he is." Warren looked up at her then, and what she saw in his face was the full culmination of everything that had been building since June of 1882, since a man with a debt note knocked on a door and was asked about a well pump, and she thought that no novel her mother had ever owned, with all their ardent language and swooning revelation, had quite managed to describe this specific quiet reality of a life that was genuinely, structurally, in all its detail good. "He'll know," Warren said. "I'll make sure of it." James Henry Ford grew with the particular energetic determination of a child who has been wanted absolutely and knows it in his bones. By his second birthday, he was everywhere on the property, supervised by Tobias with cheerful exasperation, and by Clarence with slightly less cheer, and by his parents with a combination of vigilance and the deliberate understanding that a child raised on a working ranch would need to learn the ranch, which meant being in it. Beatrice continued to run the books and expand the operations range. She hired a third hand by the time James was walking, a young woman named Pillar Reyes, Tobias's younger sister, who had grown up in cattle country and could work any part of the operation as well as anyone Beatrice had hired. This was not unremarkable in 1884 New Mexico territory, but Beatrice Yates Ford was not in the habit of passing over competence on the basis of irrelevant criteria, and Tobias confirmed that his sister was the better hand of the two, so Pillar was hired and was, as advertised, excellent. Warren and Beatrice still sat on the porch in the evenings, when the work was done and James was asleep. The conversations were different now than they had been in that first summer, less discovery and more continuity, the ongoing dialogue of two people who have learned each other thoroughly and continue to be interested. They talked about the operation, about James, about letters from Daniel in Leadville, where the mine was doing well, and Daniel had recently mentioned a woman named Clara with what he apparently considered subtlety, about the territorial politics that were always shifting, about books, always about books because Beatrice's reading had not slowed, and Warren had become an enthusiastic if slower reader who appreciated being told about things she'd finished. They talked about the past sometimes, less urgently than before because the past had been properly placed. The Marsh indictment had resulted in conviction in federal court in 1883. Warren had provided testimony by deposition, not required to travel to Santa Fe, and the letter confirming the conviction had arrived on a Tuesday in April and been read on the porch with the same ritual as the indictment letter, and then put away in the cedar box where Beatrice kept the documents that mattered. Takoda's settlement had continued in the water-sharing arrangement with full mutual observance, and the practical relationship between the settlement and the Yates Ford operation had developed into something genuine over time. Not friendship exactly, too different in circumstance for that uncomplicated word, but mutual respect enacted in regular small ways. Trade and news and the occasional shared labor at calving season when Yusef and two others came over to the North Parcel and worked alongside Tobias and Clarence with a competence that was entirely unremarkable and entirely appreciated. In the spring of 1886, Beatrice told Warren she was expecting again. He was at the desk this time, working through some correspondence, and she was in the kitchen doorway, and she said it in the same simple, direct way she'd said everything since the first morning she met him. He put the pen down and turned around and smiled at her, the full, real smile that still did something to her chest after 4 years, and said, "Good. Good," she agreed. This pregnancy was easier in most respects and harder in one. The summer heat of 1886 in New Mexico being particularly unforgiving. But Beatrice managed it with Mrs. Aldama's guidance and Warren's attentive presence, and James's cheerful unawareness of why his mother was sitting in the shade more often than usual. The second child arrived in November, another boy, whom they named Daniel Warren Ford because Warren had been corresponding with his brother more regularly since James's birth, and Daniel had visited twice more, once in the summer of 1884 and once the previous year, and was as close to a part of this family as a man in Colorado could be. And because the name felt right, circular and generous, connecting things that had been broken back to each other. Daniel Ford in Leadville, upon receiving the letter informing him of his namesake, wrote back an extremely long and somewhat incoherent response, full of enthusiastic uppercase letters that Beatrice read aloud to Warren at the kitchen table, while they both laughed at their reading. Young Daniel, called Danny to distinguish him from his uncle, was a quieter baby than James had been, darker-eyed and more watchful, and Beatrice sometimes sat with him in the late afternoons when he was awake and alert, and felt that he was cataloging the world around him with the same methodical attention she brought to everything, and found this deeply familiar and deeply funny. "Takes after you," Warren said one evening. "James takes after you," Beatrice said. "All that decisive action without sufficient pause for reflection." "James is 3 years old," Warren said. "He's supposed to act without sufficient pause for reflection." "He is exactly like you," Beatrice said. Warren looked at James, who was at that moment determinedly attempting to climb the fence post with no evident plan for what to do once he reached the top. He looked back at Beatrice. "You may be right," he said. "The years moved in the way good years do when you are fully occupied in them, not slowly and not quickly, but present, each season distinct and each year building on the last in ways that were visible in the operation and in the children and in the two people at the center of it all." The Yates Ford operation grew to run 80 head by 1888 and had enough consistent revenue to employ Tobias and Pillar and Clarence as full-time permanent staff with reliable wages, which Beatrice administered with the same precision she brought to all accounting, and which produced among the hired hands a loyalty that was not obligation but genuine, because people who are paid reliably and treated fairly tend to stay. Tobias Reyes had by 1887 developed what he apparently believed was a secret regard for Pillar Aldama, the daughter of the midwife and no relation to Pillar Reyes, who had come to work as a cook and general help in the main house when Danny was born, and who was, Beatrice privately thought, perfectly aware of Tobias's regard, and was managing its development with considerable patience. This was not Beatrice's business, and she did not make it so, but she watched the process with the affectionate interest of a woman who had run her own courtship successfully and trusted the general principle. They married in 1888. Beatrice cried at the wedding, not much, a small controlled amount that she felt Warren was aware of and had the decency not to comment on. Daniel Ford Sr. arrived from Leadville in the summer of 1888 with Clara, who turned out to be Clara Oates, a schoolteacher from Ohio who had come west 2 years before and met Daniel at a dance in Leadville, and who was exactly the kind of person that Daniel Ford's energy required: organized, warm, not easily rattled. She and Beatrice liked each other immediately on the basis of a shared preference for directness that made the first 30 minutes of their acquaintance feel like a friendship already 2 years old. They stayed for 3 weeks. Daniel worked the North Parcel alongside Warren and was, despite his years in mining, not entirely useless with cattle if closely supervised. Clara read to James and Danny in the evenings, from a book of illustrated stories she had brought, and both boys were completely absorbed. James with his father's intensity and Danny with his mother's watchful attention. On the last evening of the visit, after the boys were in bed and Daniel and Clara were sitting on the porch and Warren had gone inside for something, Clara said to Beatrice quietly, "He's very happy." Beatrice looked toward the door Warren had gone through. "Yes," she said. Daniel said he was afraid for years that his brother would never find his way back to anything good, Clara said. He said when he got the first letter about this place he read it 4 times and then he cried, which is not something Daniel does easily. Beatrice was quiet for a moment. "Warren did the finding himself," she said. "I just didn't send him away when he knocked." "I understand that's more than most people would have done," Clara said. "It turned out to be very worth it," Beatrice said, and felt the complete truth of that in every part of her. Warren came back out with the coffee and sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. The easy habitual closeness of two people who have been each other's constant for years. And Beatrice leaned into it slightly without thinking about it. And Daniel across the porch caught his brother's eye, and whatever passed between them was something between the two brothers, private and complete. By 1890, James Ford was 6 years old and asking questions at a volume and frequency that Beatrice found both exhausting and deeply pleasing, because a child who asked questions was a child who would learn, and she answered every single one of them with the same honesty and completeness she brought to everything else. He was reading with confidence, taught primarily by Beatrice in the evenings while Danny, now 4, sat on her other side and absorbed things at his own quieter pace. Warren taught them the land. He took both boys out on the property in the mornings with the unhurried patience of a man who understood that knowledge of a place was built through presence in it. And he named things for them, the plants and the birds and the features of the terrain, and he told them about the creek, and why the water moved the way it did, and about the agreement with Takota's people that meant the water was shared, and why that mattered. James asked once, age 6.5, why the Hikaria people lived the way they did, in the smaller settlement with fewer resources, when there was so much land around them. Warren was quiet for a moment, and then he said, plainly and without simplification, that the government had made decisions about where native people could live that were not fair and that had caused suffering, and that what Beatrice had done in the water agreement was a small effort to be honest in a situation that was mostly defined by dishonesty, and that it wasn't enough but it was something. James absorbed this with the focused attention he gave everything and then said, "Can we do more?" Warren looked at Beatrice across the table. "We can always do more," she said, "and we keep trying." The house had expanded by then. 2 additional rooms built in 1887, when it became clear that 2 boys and a working ranch required more space than the original structure. And the barn had been rebuilt properly. No longer the dusty place where Warren had slept on his first night, but a solid, maintained building that housed good horses and organized equipment, and was a source of particular satisfaction to Warren, who had built most of it himself. In the autumn of 1891, Beatrice sat with the ledger one evening and ran the numbers as she always did, and then set the pen down and looked across the table at Warren, who was reading the natural history book she had annotated in 1882, worn at the spine now, and accompanied on his side of the table by 3 newer volumes. "I want to tell you something," she said. He looked up. "When you walked into this kitchen in 1882, she said, "I had $47 and a broken well pump and a gun on the table, and I had spent 8 months being afraid. I want you to know that I remember exactly what that felt like, and I want you to know that it is completely gone." She paused. "I'm not afraid of anything anymore. Not the ranch, not the future, not any of it. And that is because of you and because of what we've built together, and I don't say it enough." Warren set the book down. He looked at her across the kitchen table where the lamp was burning the same way it had burned that first night, the same gold, everything else different. "You handed me a reason to stay," he said, "before you knew you were doing it. The way you sat in that chair, the way you answered the door, the The way you asked about the pump seal and went back to your coffee like the whole world wasn't on a knife's edge. I knew by that second morning that I wasn't going anywhere. You fixed my pump, she said. It was the easiest decision I've ever made, he said. The lamp moved between them. Outside, the New Mexico night was doing what it always did, enormous and clear, the stars present in a quantity the eastern sky never showed. Somewhere on the North Parcel Tobias was doing the last check of the evening, and James and Danny were asleep in their room with the sounds of the ranch around them, the sounds that were home, specific and irreplaceable. Beatrice stood up and came around the table, and he turned in his chair and she sat beside him, not across, beside, and leaned against his shoulder the way she had on the porch with Daniel watching, just the easy natural closing of distance between two people who had chosen each other completely. "Are you happy, Warren Ford?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, not uncertain, just taking the full weight of the question seriously the way he took everything seriously. "I am the happiest I have ever been," he said, "and I intend to keep getting happier." She looked up at him. "That's an ambitious plan," she said. "I've been known to follow through," he said. She smiled, and he kissed her temple, and the lamp kept burning, and the night kept turning on its enormous axle outside the windows of a house that was well built and well loved and entirely, completely home. In the spring of 1892, Beatrice discovered she was expecting a third child, which she reported to Warren with the same directness as the previous two, and which produced in him the same immediate question about her well-being, and the same subsequent expression of the feeling too large for ordinary words. They told James and Danny at supper, and James immediately began petitioning for a sister, which he had apparently been wanting since Danny failed to be one, and Danny said thoughtfully that either would be acceptable. The baby arrived in October, and this time it was a girl. Her name was Margaret Clara Ford, Margaret for Beatrice's mother and Clara for Daniel's wife, which Clara Oates Ford, upon receiving the letter about it, managed to be genuinely moved by, while insisting in her response that the baby was entirely too burdened with expectation to be named after her, and then also clearly very pleased. Margaret Ford arrived in the world with the specific determination of a third child who has observed two older brothers and found the proceedings manageable, and she was, from the beginning, a person of notable clarity about what she wanted and when she wanted it. James, age 8, became her most devoted attendant. Danny, at 6, regarded her with the same watchful curiosity he brought to everything, and was frequently found sitting near her in the manner of an interested observer. Warren held all three of his children with the same focused gentleness he had held the first, and Beatrice watched him with them and felt, each time, the confirmation of what she had known on that road in June of 1882, the complete rightness of having let him stay. The years that followed were full of the substance and variety of a working life, drives and seasons and harvests, and the children growing through their stages, James demanding and passionate and certain, Danny methodical and warm and quietly funny, Margaret simply and powerfully herself. The operation grew and adapted with the territory, which was changing around them as the railroad spread, and the population grew, and the old open-range days gave way to fenced land and recorded deeds, and all the infrastructure of a place that was becoming something more permanent. Beatrice kept the accounts with precision and looked ahead with the same methodical intelligence she'd always had, and the decisions she made for the operation were generally sound and occasionally inspired, and the one time they took a significant loss, on a winter that was harder than expected and cost them 12 head, she absorbed it and recalculated and moved forward without drama, which Warren observed with the particular admiration he had never stopped feeling for the specific quality of her mind. Takoda died in 1893, respected and in some peace. His settlement continued under younger leadership, and the water-sharing agreement would hold, had been formalized carefully enough to outlast its original signatories. Youssef, who was by then the primary voice of the settlement's dealings with the surrounding ranches, came to tell Beatrice and Warren of Takoda's passing himself, and they received the news with the solemnity it deserved. And there was a moment in the middle of that conversation where all three of them were simply quiet together, in acknowledgement of a man who had been wise enough to accept honesty when it was offered. Daniel Ford and Clara came south from Leadville in 1894 with their 2 children, a son and a daughter, and the house and the north parcel were full for 2 weeks with the particular organized chaos of 2 families combined, the 5 children in ages from 4 to 12, occupying the property with a collective energy that defeated all attempts at scheduling, and which Warren and Daniel supervised with the resigned camaraderie of brothers who have learned to laugh at the things they cannot control. James Ford, 12 years old, was by then already nearly his father's height and possessed of both parents' most definitive qualities, Beatrice's intelligence and precision, and Warren's physical capability and directness of action, combined in a configuration that was distinctly his own, and that Beatrice watched with the specific pride of recognizing someone who has become fully themselves. On the last evening of Daniel's visit, when the children were finally asleep and the 4 adults sat on the extended porch in the September dark, Daniel looked across at his brother and said, "Do you remember what you told me the last time we saw each other before the farm burned? You were 17. You said you were going to have a place of your own one day, a real place, not borrowed, not temporary." Warren was quiet. "I remembered that," Daniel said. "I remembered it through all of it. Every time I didn't know where you were or what you were doing, I held on to the 17-year-old version of you who said that." He looked at the main house, the solid adobe and timber, the lit windows. "You got there, Warren." Warren looked at the house too. Then he looked at Beatrice. She looked back at him. They did not need to say anything. They had been saying it for 12 years in every form available to 2 people who were honest with each other, in words and work and the daily choosing and the children sleeping inside, and the land around them that was theirs, genuinely, finally, entirely theirs. The stars came out over New Mexico territory in their full abundance, the same stars that had been there on the first night, the same land, different in all the ways that mattered. The Yates Ford Ranch stood solid and fenced and solvent, the well running clean, the cattle healthy on both parcels, the books balanced and the debts settled, every one of them, the official ones and the other kind, the debts of the past that get paid not in dollars but in the slow accumulated evidence of a life lived better than you feared you could. Warren Ford had come to collect a debt in June of 1882. He had found something he had not known to look for, something no promissory note had ever named, and he had understood it quickly, which was his nature, and stayed, which was his choice, and built, which was what both of them did when they were given the materials. The lamp burned in the kitchen window. Margaret was sleeping between her brothers in a room full of the sounds of the ranch. The porch held 4 people and their histories and their futures, and all the complicated, beautiful, ordinary, specific truth of lives that had come together at exactly the right moment and been wise enough to hold on. Beatrice Yates Ford leaned her head on her husband's shoulder. He put his arm around her. The night was clear, the land was theirs, and everything was exactly as it should be.